In this 10-minute biography, I will take a look at prolific science fiction writer, creator of Cthulhu, and well-known racist H.P. Lovecraft. Hey everyone, I'm Brent the Middleman, your middle-aged middle manager in Middle America, here today with the latest edition of my 10-minute biography series, which will focus on author H.P. Lovecraft. If you haven't already and would like to support the channel, please subscribe, like, and comment, which is just a quick click for you, but will forever help me, so thank you. With the popular HBO series Lovecraft Country, which is based on the book of the same name by Matt Ruff, putting Lovecraft back into the pop culture zeitgeist, I thought it would be interesting to explore the man whose writings and racist beliefs inspired the super cool fantasy horror story with black protagonists taking place in 1950s America. H.P. Lovecraft was born Howard Phillips Lovecraft on August 20th, 1890, at his family's home in Providence, Rhode Island. Lovecraft was an only child born into an upper-class family thanks to his grandfather's successful businesses. In April of 1893, Lovecraft's father Winfield was committed to Butler Hospital in Providence after a psychotic episode in a Chicago hotel. Apparently, Winfield had been doing and saying strange things in the year leading up to his episode, and he ended up dying in 1898 in the hospital after being there for 5 years. His death certificate lists the cause as general paresis, which is the polite medical way of saying late-term syphilis. This could not have been easy for Lovecraft, who was only 8 at the time of his father's hospitalization and only 13 at the time of his death. In later interviews, Lovecraft maintained that his father had fallen into a deep depression due to insomnia and being overworked. Nobody knows for sure if Lovecraft was just never told of what happened to his father, or if he was intentionally misleading people out of embarrassment. His father's illness and hospitalization, along with being an only child, caused Lovecraft to regularly escape into his own mind and imagination. His grandfather Whipple became a father figure to Lovecraft, but he traveled often for business, so they had to correspond by letter. Some sources say that Lovecraft could read and write at a high level by the age of 3. His grandfather is also the person who encouraged Lovecraft to read classical literature and English poetry. Whipple also helped Lovecraft to create original tales of winged horrors, and they would speak in deep, low, moaning sounds like monsters to entertain each other. It was the classic Gothic novels and imaginary tales that were the original influences on Lovecraft from a very early age. At the age of 5.5, Lovecraft's grandmother passed away. He saw how deeply this affected his mother and his aunts. They would regularly wear black in mourning, and this, in Lovecraft's own words, terrified him. He began having regular night terrors that would later influence his writing. In his dreams, he was haunted by what he called night gaunts. They would chase him through space and torment him with their tridents. 30 years later, the night gaunts would make an appearance in his writing. At a young age, he became enthralled with the Roman pantheon of gods, even foregoing his own Christian beliefs. He said at 5 years old he was told that Santa Claus did not exist, and this made him question the existence of God as well. It was also around this time that he took an interest in the sciences, particularly astronomy and chemistry. According to Lovecraft's own letters, astronomy became a guiding influence on his worldview. He began producing the magazine The Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy. Lovecraft was in and out of school as a young man, bouncing between public school and home tutors. His peers of the time described him as withdrawn, unless somebody shared his interest in astronomy. Then he would come out of his shell, even inviting people to look through his prized telescope. Both writing and science, especially an interest in space, dominated his youth. In the early 1900s, Lovecraft's grandfather's businesses began to suffer, and he died of a stroke soon after. Lovecraft would later call this the darkest point of his life, where he even contemplated suicide. As he got older, he was still going in and out of school due to having nervous breakdowns and clashes with teachers. When he was in school, he excelled in chemistry and physics. In 1908, as a senior in high school, Lovecraft suffered the worst nervous collapse yet. He decided not to attend college due to the stress school put on him. Lovecraft's symptoms would later be attributed to atypical depression. He stated that during his breakdowns, he could hardly bear to see anyone and would try to shut out the world with dark shades. Lovecraft's earliest work that was not self-published was a poem that appeared in a local newspaper in 1912. The poem, titled Providence in 2000 AD, envisioned a future where people of English heritage were displaced by Irish, Italian, Portuguese, and Jewish immigrants. While this poem is a bit on the nose, his later work often used aliens and monsters invading Earth as metaphors for immigrants and other races coming to America. It was also at this time that Lovecraft wrote other racist poetry, specifically on the creation of N-words, only he didn't say N-words. There is no evidence this poem was published while he was still alive. The main character in Lovecraft Country, a black man named Atticus Freeman, says that his father made him memorize and recite this poem because he did not like that Atticus loved to read H.P. Lovecraft stories. However, Atticus says that he can separate the story from the beliefs of the author, which is exactly what most Lovecraft readers have to do. World War I was also starting up at this time, and Lovecraft was extremely critical of the US government and the American public's reluctance to join the fight to protect England, which Lovecraft considered America's homeland. Seriously, HP? In 1916, Lovecraft published his early short story, The Alchemist, in a departure from his usual poetry. It was after this that Lovecraft began writing and publishing more fiction. Soon after, he wrote The Tomb and Dagon. Even Lovecraft admitted that The Tomb's style and construction followed that of his largest influence, Edgar Allan Poe. It was Dagon, though, that embraced the concepts and themes that his writing would later be known for, aka weird shit. This started a few years of incredible output, capped off in 1920, where he began to release the very first stories in his famous Cthulhu mythos. During this time, his mother was committed to the very same hospital his father had died in, and where she would die in 1921 from complications of gallbladder surgery. Can we investigate this place, please? His mother's death sent him into extreme nervous shock that had him on the brink of suicide. Despite his condition, he would still attend amateur journalist conventions, and it was at one of these conventions where he met Sonia Green, who would soon become his wife. Lovecraft's aunt strongly disapproved of Sonia, even though she had committed to supporting Lovecraft financially in order to get him to leave Providence for Brooklyn, New York. Green had been married before and said that Lovecraft performed satisfactorily as a lover. Come on, HP, you gotta do better than that with a name like Lovecraft. And she had to take charge in nearly all aspects of their relationship. On New Year's Day of 1925, Sonia just up and moved to Cleveland for a job opportunity, which would become a regular thing with her as her money dried up. This left Lovecraft having to get a small apartment in Brooklyn, which was quickly robbed, leaving him with just the clothes he was wearing. This pushed him deeper into depression, but it was in this time that he wrote the outline for the Call of Cthulhu with its theme of the insignificance of all humanity. He then had to move to an even smaller space with the money Sonia would send him, but not long after he decided to move back to Providence. The move to Providence kicked off the final decade of his life, which was also his most prolific. It was during this time that he produced his longest works of fiction, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and Out the Mountains of Madness. Lovecraft was also a ghostwriter for the magician Harry Houdini, who attempted to help Lovecraft by introducing him to the head of a newspaper syndicate. But in true Lovecraft fashion, those plans came to an end with Houdini's death. Although Lovecraft's work was popular with readers of the pulp magazines he was published in, his writing brought in very little money. This could also be attributed to how sensitive Lovecraft was to criticism. He was known to give up on trying to sell a story even after just one rejection. A few years after returning to Providence, Lovecraft and Sonia agreed to a divorce. Sonia moved to California in 1933 and remarried in 1936, unaware that Lovecraft never officially signed the divorce decree. Lovecraft's final years were rough, much like most of his life. He could not support himself with his writing and spent most of his adult life living off a small inheritance which was completely gone by the time he died. He even went without food sometimes so he could afford to mail his letters. In 1936, he got to see The Shadow over Innsmouth published as a paperback book, but the book was riddled with errors and sold about 200 copies. Ouch. The remaining manuscripts were all destroyed after the publisher went out of business. It was around this time that Lovecraft's literary career had reached its end. He stated that the hostile reception to At the Mountains of Madness had effectively ended his fictional career. Soon after, his health began to deteriorate quickly as he dealt with extreme stomach pain. Due to his fear of doctors, he was not able to be diagnosed with cancer of the small intestine until a month before his death on March 15, 1937. Hard to blame him for being afraid, though, as both his parents entered a hospital and never came back out. It wasn't until long after his death that Lovecraft started to get the acclaim that eluded him during his lifetime. Forbidden, dark, esoterically veiled knowledge is a central theme in many of his works. Many of his characters are driven by curiosity or scientific endeavor, and in many of his stories, the knowledge they uncover either fills the seeker with regret for what they have learned, destroying them psychologically, or completely destroying the person who holds the knowledge. Some critics argue that this theme is a reflection of Lovecraft's contempt of the world around him, causing him to search inwardly for knowledge and inspiration. Other themes of his work include non-human influences on humanity, in other words, monsters and gods who are worshipped by humanity for their power and who humanity serves. These creatures are generally indifferent to humans or a huge threat. Lovecraft writes often of fate and man's inability to escape it, and the end of civilization, usually destroyed by the decadence of the modern Western culture. H.P. Lovecraft, relatively unknown during his time, has had a tremendous impact on popular culture, even though he will never know, which is somewhat fitting considering his themes. Groups of enthusiasts annually observe the anniversaries of Lovecraft's death at Ladd Observatory and his birth at his gravesite. Much like Atticus in Lovecraft Country, we must separate the feelings of the man from the stories he produced. Lovecraft led a tough life filled with death and struggle, but was able to produce fantastical stories filled with horror, science, adventure, and human characters being pushed to their psychological limits. His contributions to pop culture are impressive, and it is always amazing when someone's name is still known almost a century after their death. I hope you enjoyed this look at the life of H.P. Lovecraft. Once again, I'm Brent the Middleman. Thanks for watching.